guess you guys are okay with being filmed?
Yes, sir.
Cool.
Archie, you get?
Yeah.
Part 1 is the framework, multiple conflicting notions that give meaning to just society with respect to pluralism. Freeman. A group plays a role in the aim of political philosophy and justice that can provide a shared public basis for justification. Justice presents itself not as conception that's true, one thing conservative agreement, religious authority appeals cannot work citizens have competing conceptions of truth and value pluralism inherent in political society requires active membership in a political community that respected citizens move to. Justice must be independent of any particular conception of the good citizens need to respect the existence of plurality. Pluralism requires not opposing any particular plan of life, only through participation in a community which defines the good we can acquire justice. The free individual is only possible within a certain civilization. What makes citizens a democratic regime is not the idea of a good but set of political principles, but subject to a tradition. And to clarify, community systems concern institutional design and not a question of specific policies because it's about the fundamental principles the state ought to adopt. Since people are not born with a priori conceptions of morality, the only way to be consistent with a pluralist system of shared values is to recognize that people are socially constructed. Gekowska. Souls are not free-floating atoms. People are socially constituted, penetrated by culture, influence. People are not born with built-in values, but only with a human potential to become virtuous. The potential is not self-realizing. Humans share social nature and need for attachment, context, connection to values, fostering moral obligations as well as stability. Thus, needs have to be discovered by humans who participate in shaping social structure. And societies are based on communal bonds that obligate each other to help each person in that community can look up. It is in the organization and society that we learn the virtues of moral obligation because the groups are voluntary, fair, deliberate, and responsibilities that come with them is met with disapproval or disapproval rather than legal punishment. It is a more powerful incentive to act responsibly in the association of civil society that human character and capacity for citizenship reform. One of the first obligations of citizenship is to participate in civil society, and recognizing this social formation applies with simple notion of respect between members of the community. Low 1. By the very definition of the community, we're linked to everyone, consequently obligated to them, and they to us the relationship is reciprocal. We cannot just expect others in our community to have obligations toward us which we do not acknowledge having towards them, and obligations differ from an actor, policeman is required to invest for criminals with a civilian isn't. Prefer all arguments linked to notion what a just society would do as opposed to abstract notions of individual obligations. That's the same as maintaining reciprocal respect between people and their community. Also, community is necessary for fighting oppression empirically. The worst oppressions occur when individuals are atomized and then idly by while others are harmed. They see them as a separate concern. Instead, coalitions allow people to recognize exclusions of others, and since oppressions are oppression, we stand in solidarity against injustice. I advocate that a system for presuming for that consent for organ procurement for the C should be implemented in the United States unless in CX wants to defend other dissent links. He should just ask and cross-check my thesis that governments must encourage pro-social behavior in order to have a functioning society by creating a default rule in favor of organ donation, affirming better rules of reciprocal respect between citizens and their community. Presuming consent rejects the selfish mindset by endorsing a norm of giving to the community while maintaining respect for values that don't fit within the narrow framework for solving the organ shortage. Low 2. Presumed consent tends to emphasize societal norms to weave them into the community while continuing to exhibit respect for beliefs that a pluralistic community demands making donation to supererogatory access to giving, not giving rather than giving is the norm. Further, by changing the assumption that to people being noticed, presumed consent creates a pro-social default that shows the absence of specific information like registered religious exemption. The state promotes altruistic behavior in contrast to often systems to actively promote selfishness by assuming people will be individualistic and keep their organs, failing to uphold the common good. And unlike other systems, presumed consent uniquely combines an action with the social statement to preserve reciprocal respect between citizens in the community. Otherwise, other systems might create policy changes that result in more organ donation, but then create norms to promote pro-social behavior in the long term. Additionally, presumed consent still respects the beliefs of members of the community, but for the largest societal value given life, it does need to maintain a balanced middle ground that's most consistent with understanding of shared values. Low 3. If one were to stop all ordinances would seriously to government members of the community consider the use of such organs to be reprehensible. Most members of the just community would firmly believe that it's just to give living persons organs. Presumed consent affirms this is a policy presumed consent would respect dissent. Finally, presumed consent is key to embracing and respecting the deadest members of the community. Low 4. Respect for the newly dead is symbolic of respect for the living by using newly dead as bridge to living when we make refusals of dissent. You know, we create a distorted reality when try the reality to take out of mere respect for several taking the organs of the dead is presumed that members of the same community is living, presuming dead is not wanted to function to others hardly show respect. And finally, presumed consent is key to reciprocal relations people have with their community leader. From the perspective of interconnection, the body was the start of the gift, which one was a recipient, but it's not correct to say that I do his body seen his gift, never possession donation because when fulfilling such obligation, the gift is reciprocated in a way that benefits others. Interdependence is conferred in the most vital way through the sharing of one received, one participation, larger circulation. Under review, NAC must defend the policy clarifying stage approach to organ procurement and deceased, otherwise the sense of AC offers to one reciprocal sense. Only the NAC can question assumption the resolution must prosecute fairness by ensuring equal access to ballot terms also keeping classes, and they have to counter arguments instead of indicting assumptions that clash with quality of education by promoting substantive engagement. And Atkins RBI ASA point Affleck's negative stability collapse and needs alerts. The Atkins stability collapse and winner needs alert asking more skewed because of time pressure hurdles. The Atkins and RBI engagement theory bid all BC point response only the NAC can retrieve because only the Atkins T burden the Afghan reciprocally respond to need the RBI to compensate for the NAC's unique avenue. The ballot CISA point the one hour too short to be theory compared to the NAC. So the avenue is alert to be reciprocal rather than adding more unreciprocal avenues. Sorry, Arjun skipped down to the bottom. Presumed that solves the organ shortage in Campello et al. 07. Sample of 34 countries over 5 years clarified doctor presumed that a positive effect 21 to 26% on cadaveric organ donation and presuming that faces the illegal organ trade through increasing supply and decreasing the cost of obtaining an organ delays 05. Presumed consent is the best method of legally obtaining organs if the demand for organs are met legally, people have less. Instead of the market would diminish, presumes that lowers cost, the nation would be performing more transplants have fewer patients on dialysis, and the illegal organ trade disproportionately harms the poor. They become ontologically insecure, void of freedom, Shepherd Hughes. Kidney transplant producing global scarcity. This has led to an abundant new source of organs in the bodies of the living among the poor. Transactions extend life to some highly privileged patients at the expense of expendable bodies. Globalization release a voracious appetite for foreign bodies due to the shadow market production to provide fresh organs for consumption. Now go back up to the plots card. Moreover, organ conscription fails and is a recipe for totalitarianism. Plots. In conscription, the state assumes full ownership of the individual body. Recipe for totalitarianism. One, citizens have no significant share in state decision-making values promulgated directly. Most significant aspects of life associated will has been used to justify states forcing the wills of individuals. The state ignores the problems of organ transportation, imposes on virtually good sex expansion of government authority over bodies incompatible with democratic society, and the state may not defend conscription of all cadaveric organs without a religious option. Aids supports the policy to turn their solvency, negates auto access to all supply advantages, all means we can attack by the efficacy of the system as well as less engagement. B. Conscription has never been implemented with no empirical evidence on either side. Less clashes. Every argument is just hypothetical grounds to keep substantive engagement about long responses to base over issues, and substantive engagements with voters leads to portable advocacy skills, and making arguments is inherent to the nature of debate. So you affirm.
Alright, so the only thing you didn't read is you just moved the Potts card in the
right
under it.
Yeah, I read it.
Okay, cool. Ready?
Yeah.
What is actually the standard? So the totalitarianism argument at the bottom of the case is a link to your standard, correct?
It's just not necessarily. It's just a preemptive.
Does totalitarianism impact your standard or not?
I don't.
Like,
I mean,
yes or no question.
Probably not, because West standards means-based conception, which means that
okay, so
if the end if you were to, it would depend.
Why does it matter?
Like, I don't do that weighing the AC.
Okay, it's not a weighing question. It's just like, why does totalitarianism matter?
It would depend on what framework you read.
Okay, so just a potential link into some negative framework.
Right.
Okay. The standard is, or like the wording of the standard is something like maintaining reciprocal respect. What is? Well, first of all, the standard. You said the standard is means-based just now. So why does so it's not about procuring organs, but rather about the social statement you say it makes, correct?
It's a question of the norm that creates the policy of presumed consent, and whether that's a norm that.
So my question is, there seems to be two strands of offense in the AF, in the AF contention. The first is it creates a norm, i.e., implementing the policy.
No, it's not about creating a norm of donation. It's about the fact that the norm of like individuals being members of the community.
You said
a
line from the AF is other systems might create policy changes, but they do not create norms that promote pro-social behavior. So I think you're So the link to the app is that presumed consent is created by a norm of pro-social behavior. Wait, so it is.
It's not reliant on the fact.
So the question is, who is most consistent with the norm of pro-social behavior? Is the point?
That's not. I mean, that would be one way to link offense back to the AC. Like, you'd have to show that your policy maintains reciprocal respect.
Right. So what is the? It is not.
Like, my argument is that
it's not about the norm that presumed consent results in. It's about consistency with pro-social behavior.
That's one argument. But you can also have a policy that's consistent with pro-social behavior that doesn't treat individuals as members of the community in other ways. That's not the only link to our standard.
So
that's one way that offense can
function. So the second link to your standard is consistency with understanding shared values. What are our shared values?
So shared values are just values that are like promulgated in communities. It's like values where we treat
individuals. So why does presumed consent not do that? Like, why doesn't it impose the idea of taking organs on people who disagree with that? Then?
So the Lowy 2 evidence, I think, or it might be Lowy 3, is pretty good on this question. It says that presumed consent isn't imposing a norm of like just donation on people because they have the ability to opt out. So it's a good balanced middle ground between like just.
Wait, read me the line in the Lowy evidence that says that. I don't think your evidence actually says that.
It says that if one were to salvage all we can start with prep.
I'd like you to answer the question.
Okay.
I'll start prep.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. If one were to salvage all organs, this would discomfort members of the community. Most members of a just community would affirm the belief it's just to give living persons organs.
So my question was not
a policy of presumed consent with respect to set.
Why? That's a claim. Where's the warrant?
because the idea of presumed consent is that we take your organs unless you opt out. Also, I think that the totalitarianism argument could probably link back to my standard. Like, if conscription is, like, the ideology behind it is totalitarianism.
Alright. Why is it linked to your standard then?
I mean, I don't make those links in the app. Like, I could explain right now the 1AR links I'd probably make if you want me to. I haven't made those arguments yet. It's just a preempt.
Alright, cool.
Oh, do you know if we have 4 or 5 minutes of prep?
It's
5, okay. Yes, please. How many sheets am I giving you?
2. Actually 3. It's titled Speech 1 and C, 6 p.m. Let me know when you have it up.
Alright, yeah, I'm good.
Is everybody ready?
Wait, 2 off or 3?
3.
3.
Freedom is the foundation of all theories. First, all action, even arguing, requires us to be free. Acting is to deny that freedom is a contradiction, so we must accept freedom as an axiomatic principle. There are 2 reasons this justification would outweigh all. The F justification, the A subquote, is this is a limit on what things are logically possible to argue. Even the F theory, since some principles are argumentative non-contradiction, since it must be argued for to be established in the first place. B, for a theory to generate obligation must be uncontestable, since otherwise the theory's starting assumption will be questioned to undermine the theory's validity. Only non-contradiction provides describing since a contradiction establishes axiomatic truths to provide that are an uncontestable ground for action. Second, people should be free since it allows them to choose moral principles for themselves. Restricting this choice creates a risk of moral harm to prevent them from achieving their own goals, which they judge to be able to end, so it requires proactive justification. However, limits on freedom cannot be justified to benefit future freedom, since this makes freedom contingent upon arbitrary external events, which means that the NC standard is not consequential. So all the reason why the AC standard is means-based as opposed to end-based would also justify the MC being means-based for the same justification, because all these often provides means-based are also applied to NC. Thus, laws must be created in a way that fairly accepts the freedom of citizens. This makes mandates appropriate checks on state power. Mueller 96. Citizens ideally would make all decisions collectively, but such a rules impractical and cost economize by choosing agents to make decisions for it. Citizens agents may not advance citizen interests. The founding fathers chose to mitigate this through checks and balances. Citizens must define these institutions that all parties to the constitutional contract abide by. Therefore, the standard is ensuring appropriate checks on state power. Two more justifications. First, it's a prerequisite to any other theory, since without checks there would be no guarantee that the state would follow any other theory. Checking state power ensures the state acts ethically in general, otherwise the AC becomes unenforceable and vacuous. This precludes A. It's meaningless to make moral demands on states if they're not structured to act morally. For example, you couldn't condemn a tree for growing immorally. This precludes the aspect that determines where morality even applies. B. It's key to all other theories. Even if the act is true, you need the NC to enforce it first, which means a prerequisite. Even if they win every claim made in the AC framework, you would just default to the NC. Second, it's specific obligation of the state, since legal documents require that the state respect the will of its citizens. Action specificity outweighs all comparisons. It's good or right action always contextual to specific moral agents. Proceeding that makes us vulnerable to totalitarian abuse, creates a line drawing problem where bodily autonomy becomes subservient to the wishes of the state. Sherman 14. State ownership of capital actions to interventionists and state can consent on our behalf. Just exercising ownership over our bodies using consent will be the victory of the totalitarian acknowledgement that they own us to the last issue. Opt-out entails making an individual vulnerable to totalitarian ideologies. Difficult to imagine where the line can be drawn and implies an underlying wish to be passed, which can lead to other areas hindering autonomy. This also turns the aspect of people will not trust a state that justifies totalitarian abuse, so it means that they will opt out of the system, which means that there would not actually be a norm created in favor of altruism and would only increase self-intention. Additionally, this links to the affirmative his justification at the bottom of the case, the justifying the totalitarianism argument. He says in cross that this potentially links to the affirmative, which means he's not allowed to deny this argument and deny the link to from the MC to the AC in the next speech. Also, is the strongest control link to the act, because if people don't have freedom in the office, they can't act in other ways in order to benefit other people, which means they're in control. The intro link to altruism also denies individual ability to choose for themselves as a basis, or all his pluralism arguments would assume this that people should be able to choose for themselves that it's key respecting their values, which the community has to do. Now, or actually, sorry, my bad. Next off. Any external imposition of a conception of a good is morally bankrupt. The good depends on the preferences of people. Mackie 78. People differ radically about the kinds of life they choose to pursue in general. People cannot make total plans of life they choose successfully pursue various activities. They set out to formulate a goal-based moral theory, but identify that there's not one goal and that there are objects of progressive choice. Our theory will change to the rights-based one. The thesis of this position is that I'll concede that, or this says that even if the affirmative wins affirming that you cannot reconcile pluralism by saying that people are constructed or that there's an obligation to help each other. Rather, pluralism has to be absolute, i.e., the state has to absolutely respect people's right to choose for themselves. Otherwise, it would contradict the fact that people cannot make a total plan of life, which answers is symbolic evidence. Additionally, this also answers Lowy evidence. Values based on how we perceive it. If people enjoy pain without being bad, deciding good for something else is impossible since good is subjective, which proves the theory value. Additionally, so now the opposite link to this. First, explain properties in communities find an opposition that which is good, reasoning that by imposing a specific culture of prolonging life and utilitarian fragmentation would assure superiority over other cultures. Sometimes does not leave room for active distinction for silence as a mode of participation. Minorities remain disadvantaged. The burden is theirs, regardless of language barriers and communication problems in a multicultural society. And community should respect cultural difference. Independently disadvantages the Lowy 3 evidence. He merely asserts that it's easy to opt out. First, this argument has literally no warrant to ask for the cross-examination, but it's just a blanket assertion that it's easy to opt out. Whereas this evidence has several warrants explaining that it is not as easy to opt out. Second, or additionally, even if I don't win the Mackey evidence, this topic still links to the standard because it says that you suppress the ability of people to express their norm sets, which controls the Lowy 3 and Lowy 4 evidence. Also outweighs his opposition argument. The Lowy 4 evidence says that it's key to respecting the rights of the gender. Obviously, dead people are not actually part of the community. They're not active in everything. This is participation is symbolic, right? The actual participation of people who are in communities, i.e., their ability to express their own opinions, it outweighs that symbolic pro-social norm. It also links to the standard because it would not because you can justify it would justify the norm of suppressing people's norms. These to its literally sort in which it would be possible to force one person's moral on other people's morals. And another part, legitimate deliberation must be non-coercive. The state cannot impose the requirements on some, so that they must respect other people's preferences, which answers Lowy 3 evidence. Tries to go 2. The condition for authentic deliberations reflection in a non-coercive fashion is rules out attempts to impose ideological conformity. Authentic democracy can be then essential to existence, degree that reflected preferences influence collective decision. Next up is the Kemp plan. Kemp plan text United for organ sharing should implement a national donor registry and priority based on willingness to donate. Hughes 09. The U.S. should immediately implement a national donor registry and a system of priority based on willingness to donate. These proposals are consistent with the altruism-based organ procurement system in place in the United States. The first mutually exclusive, it's logically impossible to prioritize based on the willingness to donate. If everyone is opted in at 1 second, competes to have benefits of voice and see as well as the pluralism argument, which means that it is better to do the Kemp plan alone than a permutation. This solves the case the perception of fairness, gender is more willing participants, and it solves altruism in Hughes 2. Left shares discourages people from destroying organ managers, discovering that your organ by pushing the 180 waiting period fractionalization is based on an intuitive sense of fairness, but also creates a strong incentive to delay based on a person's self-interest or program nature, wanting to generate wider participation in enough to constitute a reliable supply of organs to meet demand. Case. The framework, starting on the framework, value pluralism is something that the entity is consistent with this argument, which is obviously consistent with the assumption of freedom. However, I just have to answer the reciprocal respect argument first. It's not, even if you have an obligation to respect other people, that doesn't mean that is an obligation the government can enforce on people. That creates a slippery slope in which the government can enforce your obligations. For example, even if you have a moral obligation to do something, that doesn't mean the government can force you to do it. That should be left to your own choice, which will solve all the affirmative framework. Now, he says there's an obligation to help each other. Obviously, that is something the community would require, but people should have the freedom to choose for themselves. They should arrive at that judgment by their own will. There's literally no justification in the act why the role of a government should be to impose this obligation. Prefer the answer on actor specificity. It's the only thing that actually explains how the government would do this. And he says opting out is easy. That is not the case. People don't even know that the organs are transplanted. That's Jacob 3. Silence can be interpreted as ignorance of the presumption that you asked a survey about organ transplant laws revealed that only 5% of random speculative respondents were aware of the decision and active pursuing consent. This also turns all of his offers. People are not going to do it out of altruism. It's just which means it's not actually consistent with that value. They don't know if pursuing consent exists.
Ready?
Yeah.
Wait, actually, before I start, can you flash me the counterplan?
Oh, yeah.
And also just delete
I'll just flash you a different document.
Oh, okay, yeah, that would be great. So I'll just delete this one.
Cool.
Thank you.
No problem. Can I flash right here?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so it's speech 1 and 2 round.
Yeah, it's the same document.
Oh, okay.
6 p.m.
Alright. Good?
Yep.
So, what's the United Network for Organ Sharing?
It's the network that distributes organs. So it's I just thought there was a counterplan flaw argument that was made that the United States is not
it's
the act.
mutually exclusive because it's impossible to prioritize based on willingness if everyone opted in at once.
Correct.
So
do you just want me to
yeah,
explain the
like when would everyone opt in at once?
The point is not everybody. So if people opt in, so if there's enough people who opt in to solve the organ shortage as you claim in the app, then you can't prioritize based on willingness to donate because the organ shortage would already be solved.
Okay.
Whereas basing it on altruism would both solve the organ shortage, but would also create a
So
altruism
the reason that it turns the app is because it creates a norm of altruism.
Correct.
Is that the only reason?
It also solves all the your advantages are about rejecting a selfish mindset that results from informed consent. Solves that because it means that people would be more altruistic. You say that there's a pro-social default in the status quo. Solves that because it means people would be acting on the basis of altruism. It solves your norming argument. You said that one of the pieces of offense in the app is that it creates a social statement that creates norms.
Okay.
Counterplan.
Okay, I thought we clarified that didn't link to the app.
So
let's talk about these two different frameworks that you read. If I beat back, these are disclosed as two different entities on your wiki. So if I beat back the first framework that we care about, freedom, then we just default to the second framework, right?
They're not two frameworks. Okay, so let me explain how these two are. So the pluralism NC is just a case turn. I labeled it as an off because it would be confusing to flow.
Okay.
There's a reason why you are inconsistent with pluralism, and then the Mackey evidence is just not a framework argument. It's just a piece of wing that explains how you should prefer this offense to your framework over arguments about norming.
So let's talk about the reasons. Let's talk about the reasons. So the turns on the AC are the case, like the Lowy 2 turn, then the totalitarianism turn from the counterplan. Am I missing any?
Yeah, the off case was a turn to the app.
Right, besides that.
Disrespect pluralism.
Right, besides that.
The counterplan obviously solves the app.
Yeah, I'm talking about independent, analytic turns that aren't in this document. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything.
Hang on. the totalitarianism argument turns the case, and the argument for why the NC controls the internal link to all the framework arguments.
So let's talk about.
No, that's it.
So let's talk about the freedom argument. You say that because we're arguing means that we automatically assume that freedom is good.
Mm-hmm.
Why is does that mean that we have to always value freedom? Is this a deontological constraint? Can we weigh freedom violations?
That's a misunderstanding of the F. It is not either deont nor is it util. It says that freedom is something that is structured by government actors, so the government should structure itself in a way that prevents i.e. its consistency with the government should structure itself in a way that is consistent with freedom or conducive to freedom.
Yeah. What's the status of the counterpoint?
I will defend it dispositionally.
What does that mean?
So if you make a theory argument, then I should be able to say drop the argument and take the counterplan.
So just for theory.
Also, if there is, if you have something that's not offense again, so a permutation, and
you can take it if it's a pronoun.
Yeah, if it's a pronoun. Yeah.
Jacob 3 turn the half?
Because it says that people. So at the plan or the app does not mean that people are acting out of altruism. If people don't know about the law, then you don't actually encourage pro-social behavior. You don't reject a selfish mindset.
Okay. Okay, 3 minutes. AC offense versus the turn, and counterplan freedom NC plurals and off. I'll signpost. There's a lot of stuff. Ready?
He's conceded freedom that ethics is a question of institutional design means that we do not care about the consequences of policy. The only arguments that are ethically relevant are those pertaining to the norms of creating policy, because that's what citizens would actually agree on. Means that his turn about why presumed consent doesn't allow people to opt out when they don't know they'd be able to opt out has no implication on the framework. Just a question of what norms influence the policy of creation means that the only offense under the AC framework is the low E2 card that says presumed consent is made out of the norm that people should have obligations to their societies. That's the only offense links to the AC. I was very clear and cross-examined that none of the offense about presumed consent creating norm is actually relevant under my framework. It's just a question of whether the norm that justifies presumed consent is pro-social or not.
Go to the counterplan.
First, Pern do both. There's no reason it's competitive. The only competition is that if everyone opted in, it would be logically impossible. Obviously, no one would ever opt into a real-world situation, so not competitive. Also, we can still prioritize based on the time that they chose to donate. He said that we just prioritize based on donor willingness, but if someone chose to donate earlier, then that means we can still do the counterplan altruism first. It's cross-applied. It's not about creating a norm, not about having people have the consequence of being altruistic about the norm because in justifying policy. Also, it just makes people act in their self-interest because they want to donate, help the community, but that's just because it would benefit them by getting their own organs, so it's not actually altruism. Here's an individualist conception of ethics. Asking how to NC. First off, the freedom is the foundation of ethics. One is the conflation of political freedom and free will. Just because there are political rights doesn't mean you can't make choices. Second, conflates free and post-fail. Speaking as debater doesn't mean that in the post-fail world we value freedom. Third, we can't be free in a vacuum. It only makes sense with community respect to the community to prerequisite. That's mood. Fourth, he said that individuals need to choose their own goals, but atomized ethics is bad since it comes from social context. Also nonsensical. That's the council office to check on state power first and no like the resolutions about society's obligation to people, not how people should create their government communities, determine context for people in society. So it outweighs is also means that I outweigh active specificity. He's just talking about government obligations, but I'm working international to society obligations. Second, it's not about protecting freedom. It says that we prefer citizens' interest in politics. They should write a constitution. Not the constitution is key to the freedom. Third, this just says that we need to establish a constitution to preserve freedom. The AFSL has a constitution, which means that I solve all 100% of the often terms of the community strongest check on the government. It forms a barrier between citizens, since it forms a barrier between citizens and the government. So it's key to ensure that they're not being violated. Fifth, he says that states protect citizens. But A begs the question of what the best way to protect citizens is. Only AC answers that question. Also, it's the ISOP fallacy. Just because states have contracts doesn't mean that they're actually good. Often it creates a line drawing problem. One, opt-out means that there's literally no impact in the hypothetical world. In the hypothetical world, the after events, there's no line drawing problems. People just opt out of the system, not controlled by the state. Second, the people are dead, which means that they're not actually denying their freedom since they're not allowed to have freedom in the first place. They're not subservient to the state. We don't have rights to our bodies in the first place, so we should just donate our autonomy to the community. That's the conceded leader evidence means there's no impact on the NC off pluralism. First off, fact that we can't impose external goods. One, our values are shaped by the community. That's moved to the AC. Forever is still a prerequisite. Often linking back to prerequisite. Second, allowing people to choose their own good is atomism. That's nonsensical. Since we come from social context, that's the council also find whether communitarians is the best thing. It doesn't matter if other cultures think other things. That just means that they're wrong for hurting the community. Often policies have to be justified. One community determines what policies people agree on since they're socially constructed. That's new. Second, communities key to solving coercion to stand together and fight oppression means that the AC offers a prerequisite to evaluating any of this third citizens have bad rules and harm the community coercion. It's in bad sense it just guides them in the right direction. Strongest link to my favorite fourth. Even people disagree the afters and mandate donation. We allow opt-out key to individual choice. Individual choice with matter is better create a default rule in favor of donation. Also, all of this often is about why any real world people haven't been able to opt out. It doesn't matter. It's not a consequentialist theory. It's just a means of creating the norms, and none of those actions actually links back to my standard. Often it can't be coerced. One, if we don't uphold reciprocal rules and we ignore our voices, then we're not obligated to us. That could look also second. There's no reason why pluralism means we have to look to all of these views of murderers should still be rejected as morally wrong. Otherwise, they allow atrocious acts. And third, there's no reason why letting people talk against the policy would be justified at all. And then we have to listen to all of their voices for policies don't have community in mind. They won't represent voices. Even the people speaking out the stage can just ignore them. Fourth, makes the question for why coercion is bad. AC purposes we're nudging people in the right direction to get off that. It imposes norm. First, not even often presumes favor those who don't want to donate organ silences. Those who want to be donors. Second, no reason PLC silences those who opt out. All you have to do is check a box on an organ donation form with the DMV. No one has to know your church turn. Third, turn after peace deliberation because people with strong rejections have to be vocal about the leaders and contribute to the marketplace of ideas within the world. They can still stay silent. Fourth, turn people can't participate in democratic process. They're dead. I solve the organ shortage. That's conceded evidence in the AC that I solve the shortage. Fourth, after I solve the legal market, he's excluding entire groups completely by pressing them so they can't weigh on any issues outweighs on magnitude.
Alright, I have 2 minutes remaining. Can I see the doc you're reading off?
Yeah.
The order is the NC, then the AF, the counterplan, and then pluralism.
Okay. Can I see my computer?
You mind if I still look at it, or
yeah? Can we just keep it like here so we can get the best of both worlds? Awesome. NC aft counterplan pluralism?
Yeah. Is everybody ready? The problem with the two problems with the last speech. The first is blippiness. Your arguments must allow pen time. If you didn't flow all of the block of an argument, then you should be heavily skeptical of when he goes for an argument that you didn't flow in the 2 and R. This is especially problematic because I do not know which arguments you flowed versus which arguments I flowed. I might have flowed the 1 and 4. You might have flowed the 2 and 3. But then you do not know. I don't know what you flowed, which means I don't know what I'm going to respond to. Which means you should be heavily skeptical of this. Each of these arguments were blippy. They're all one-line responses. The second problem was that you are just reading a prep, but you have dropped a couple crucial arguments on the NC. Arguments that I've answered since the last time I read this NC against you. First, under the value criterion, there are 2 arguments that explain why the NC comes before any other standard. The first is that it's a prerequisite to any other theory. Since that checks would be no guarantee that the state would follow any other theory, even if the aft theory is true. You do not know whether the society or the government will act in a way that is consistent with that, because the only checking state power ensures that the state will act ethically in general. Otherwise, if AC becomes unenforceable. There are 2 pieces of weighing for this. The A sub point is that you can't make moral demands on states if they're not structured to act morally. For example, the aft is equivalent to claiming that trees are growing immorally, or that they ought to grow in a different way. That is nonsensical because they cannot choose to do so. The state is not structured in a way that allows it to act morally in the first place, and everything the 1AC said is vacuous, and you cannot regard the moral claims it makes on the state. The second piece of weighing, the B subpoint, says that it's key to other theories. Even if the aft is true, you need the NC to enforce it first. This means that even if everything, this is explicit in 1NC, even if everything he said was true, then you should just default to the NC because it's the only way to ensure that the state actually does what is consistent with the aft in the first place. This was dropped, which means that you should be heavily skeptical of any new applications he does in the 2AR. I'm sure he's going to apply a lot of the arguments above in the 2AR in ways that I not predict. Obviously, that is unfair because the 3NR I do not have a 3NR, which means that the 2NR cannot predict anything he's going to say, which means that you should only have arguments that were explicitly, the only arguments that were explicitly responsive. That's too bad for him because he did not have any explicit responses. Now, I'll preempt arguments that I think he might apply. The first argument at the very top was the block of 4 arguments he has at the top just says that you cannot regard freedom as an absolute. That is not the argument I'm going forward, which means I don't need to enter this. He says that there in Mueller evidence, he says he has a block of 4 more arguments that explains that answer C part of the first argument says that it's not about governments but about just society. That is not relevant because obviously presumed consent is something that is operated by the government. Yes, just society is the one that is doing presumed consent, but the government is the one that passes a law. No one else is capable of passing law, and every single piece of top literature agrees with that. I'm only reading evidence on this issue. I did Shearman evidence. He has no evidence that explains that a community would enforce that. You should also be skeptical of the 2AR shifting. Yes, I know he's going to explain that I meant this all along in the 2AR, but that is not consistent with the plans. Every single person on this topic is agreeing. It's always the government doing it because presumed consent is a law. Even if just society is the actor, that still entails the passage of law by the government, which means that still applies. He said also, even if this argument is true, there's still a link. Just societies presuming consent would justify totalitarianism by the government, which means that there's still a link to the NC. He says that it's about constitution construction. That's group number 2 and 3. That is not that you're missing the point here. Yes, the Mueller evidence is in context of constitution construction, but it says why freedom requires a great overall structure that requires state power to be structured in a positive way rather than one that infringes on freedom, which means it's not responsive. He says number 4 says that communitarianism also solves freedom. Also not relevant because even if the framework solves freedom, the contention of the act was relevant. Whether presumed consent would be good or bad for state power, even if communitarianism solves freedom, you have conceded that your plan or that your advocacy would result in a violation of freedom, and because it would harm state power. Also not responsive to the argument about the enforcement argument I'm going for. His five argument is false, that also does not respond to enforcement. He's dropped a very important argument here. So you lose. Now, also extend the number 2 that says, it's key to, this is the most specific to obligation of states since legal documents require that the state respect the will of its citizens. He's also dropped meta-framing issues. To action specificity outweighs all other comparisons and is good or right action or contextual specific moral agents. There's too much line by line, and the 1AR are not allowed to weighing arguments. Be skeptical of 2AR weighing arguments because I have 3 and R to respond to them. Default to the comparison the 2 and R does. The meta-framing here that was both in the 1 and that was dropped from the 1 and C is that you should frame the debate through actor specificity. He has dropped a response on the AC that explains why you are not specific to the actor, which is a reason why you can basically throw out the AC framing default to neg. He has dropped an I'm key to actor specificity and actor specificity first. Even if he wins the AC framing, he says that winning the AC framing is the reason you default to the NC. That's number 1. All the weighing was conceded, so you do not allow me responses. When I make arguments that are weighed, you need to answer them. Contention of the act.
His first argument is opt-out solves, but that opt-out can only solve when people know about the system in the first place. Cross-apply the card that was read on the app. The Jacob 3 evidence says that people do not know that the law is even being passed, which means you obviously can't opt out. He says that they're dead, which means there's no violation, not relevant. Presumed consent is the acknowledgement that the state owns us, which is why it would be legitimate. It's also answers this Freeman evidence with any reason why the NC standard of contention would link to the app, because it is based on the principle, i.e. that is the norm that it acts upon, which is how he frames it in the Freeman evidence. His third argument says that you would donate your autonomy to the community. Obviously, that's something that is inconsistent with the NC. If I win the NC for everything, that would get rid of it. He's also conceded that in terms of case of totalitarianism means that you can never express your actions to the community, you can never express your obligation to the community, because the state would just restrict that, and would not be an authentic expression of altruism, because you're not doing it because you want to, you're doing it because the state has told you to, which eternal defense of the framework, and a reason why I turn the case. So if I just have to answer the Freeman evidence or the Schumann, or I think I'm already winning the NC. So the Schumann evidence is also pretty good and was not sufficiently answered. Now the AC. Or actually, real quick before I forget, counterplan, conceded permutation, it's a test of competition, I'm not going for this. It's dispositionalized, so if you read permutation, I can kick it. The pluralism NC, also not going for this argument. He is defense at all levels of it. I'll concede the defense of pluralism is not relevant. Go to the app. The problem here is that he has not extended the cards in his framework. He only says the Freeman evidence, but does not extend the remaining internal links to the app, nor did I hear him extend a piece of offense to the app, which means you lose. You do not extend offense, you lose throughout. Also, his drop response to the app is not consistent with the actor's specificity, because it only says why we have obligations to each other, because I explain why the state would enforce its obligations, which means it does not actually say anything about what government should do or what just society ought to do, just what individuals ought to do, which means that it is radically inconsistent with the actor's specificity. You know we are weighing about what kinds of moral claims come first. He has dropped the actor's specificity claims first, and that I have a link to norming, which means even if Freeman. Yeah.
Wait, what's the last argument that AC's framework's about what individuals should do?
That was the second last argument.
So you concede all the offense under the app, right? Like,
No.
you don't extend the low A3 terms, right? The only offense you have under the app is totalitarianism.
They're totalitarianism offense as well as the Jacob 3 card read on the app.
Did you extend that?
Yeah, I didn't say extended, I said cross-apply, which is the same. I repeated the warrant and cross-applied it.
Okay. So, the reasons we care about freedom, key to the state enforcing it.
Wait, what?
This is the prerequisite argument.
That's not that. Okay, no, that's a misunderstanding. It's not that we care about freedom because the state has to enforce it. It says the NC standard. You have to ensure checks on state power to ensure that the state acts on any other moral theory.
Okay. So the Jacob 3 argument is that people don't know about the law, so they can't opt out, right?
Right.
That's the term you cross the line, okay? AC, offense, and then NC.
don't extend offense. He's missing the extension of Lowy 2, which is the presumed consent is based on the norm of a pro-social default. He's also conceding that ethics is a question of institutional design. That's Freeman because it's only based on the norms that citizens rationally agree on, not on the consequences of policies. That's a conceded argument that takes out his Lowy 3 term. It's not a question of the result of presumed consent, whether or not people can opt in or opt out. It's about the norm that creates the policy, whether it's pro-social or anti-social means. It also takes out this totalitarianism argument because it's not just an effect of the policy of presumed consent. The only things that like factor by standard are whether the norm that creates presumed consent is in favor of donation or against donation, in favor of the community or against the community. And so the Lowy 2 offense is the only piece of offense that actually links back. He also says that I don't extend any framework argument. That's clearly not true. I extend a lot of frameworks in framework arguments and cross application to his arguments. Then he says that it's just a question of what individuals should do. Should do not what a just society should do, but the conflicting evidence says that because we're all respective parts of the society, the conflicting says that because we're all respective parts of the society, that societies have an obligation to treat individuals as members of the community. That's the entirety of the AC framework. Clearly not talking about just individual obligations. The AC is criticizing individual obligations, saying that society obligations have to be reciprocal. NC. He tries to go for the, he goes for actor specificity. The big problem for him is that the actor in the resolution is not a government, it's a just society, which means that arguments linking back to society obligations specifically outweigh. That's problematic for him because he's conceding the AC framework justifications for why Marx consistent with society obligations. His first argument is that that the implementing of policy of presumed consent requires the government, and there's no reason why the AC advocacy is implementing the policy of presumed consent. The advocacy text is presuming consent for organ procurement of the deceased and saying that people in a society should presume that individuals would have donated, not the implementation of an opt-out system like it's traditionally described. Which you're not talking about government obligations. Also, just because the government implements the policy does not mean that it's about the government obligation. Means that the society is using the government as a tool to implement the policy. So we still link society obligations. At that point, he's conceding reason why community obligations would first extend all the church for state power argument. The communities are the things that determine contracts for people in society. So it specifically outweighs even if governments has contracts with the citizens and communities. Are the things that emphasize the contracts. In addition, he says that the Constitution is key, but the AFSL has a constitution means that I solve 100% of the ends. Office. In addition, he concedes the term the community has the strongest check on the government since it forms a barrier between citizens and the government. Protecting the community is a prerequisite for him getting access to any of the government obligations argument because the only way that we can check back against totalitarianism is if we form communities to stand together against the government. Go to totalitarianism. He's conceding too much defense here. Said first that people can opt out of the system means there's no way it's totalitarianism because the government doesn't have control over individuals. They can opt out. So, and the majority of his offense. In addition, the fact that these people are dead means that we're not actually harming their interests. We're just taking organs away from dead people. It's not a totalitarian policy at all because we're not taking anything from the people. At a minimum, there's absolutely no offense here. He's also conceding the leader evidence in the AC, which is that we don't even own our bodies in the first place because our organs are just gifts from us from communities, which means that we should just give those organs back to people as a reciprocal obligation within our community. It's not a question of whether or not the state has control over organs because we don't have rights to those organs in the first place. He's not extending any reasons why individuals need freedom or autonomy. He just says we need checks on state power. He's conceding key reasons why protecting the community is a prerequisite to state power.